Affairs.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I really, at the outset, want to pick up where you left off. I commend the Attorney-General for bringing this bill to the House. It hasn't been a quick thing, and I know from hearing the Attorney-General report to the Government Caucus Room, to caucus committees and talk with colleagues about the development of this bill, introduced last year and being extensively considered through the proper parliamentary processes, that this is something that he is rightly personally proud of and has put a lot of careful intellectual thought into and extensive consultation. These are complex areas of legislation, as you know, Deputy Speaker, because they intersect with state and territory regimes and balance competing rights. These are always contested bills, rightly so, in a democracy, because when you're measuring one set of rights, and some would rightly say freedom of speech is a critical value in our society, but freedom of speech is not unlimited. Never has been. You can't incite people to violence, you can't defame people, you can't breach national security classifications. In any decent society, there's always been some limits to freedom of speech, and in this case it's a complex set of things that we balance. But it is a significant piece of legislation. Let there be no doubt at the outset that the government is committed to protecting the community from those amongst us who would promote extremism or violence, hatred, or seek to incite violence. That's a values-based commitment. No Australian should be targeted because of who they are or what they believe, and the government has worked diligently to introduce this legislation to create new criminal offences and to also strengthen the protections in existing criminal offences to strengthen the protections against hate crimes. The bill will create new criminal offences for directly threatening the use of force or violence against a group or a member of a group. And these offences, importantly, I've had a lot of emails from people who are a bit confused, does it protect this characteristic or this group? Importantly, these offences will protect groups or members of groups distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, national or ethnic origin or political opinion, providing protection to Australians right across the community from hate speech and those who would urge violence. I'll make a couple of contextual remarks, though. I believe we're the world's most successful multicultural society, one of the most diverse societies on the planet. Probably up there, can run a bit of a book with Canada, but I'll claim that we're the most successful. But just being a diverse society is not the same thing as being a successful multicultural society. We can all think of countries that are diverse that are not successful. Indeed, the member for Wentworth recommended a book when we caught up for a cup of tea last year, and I will admit I didn't finish it over summer as I promised. I give you this confession now, but I did get through another couple of chapters. But part of the thesis of that book was observing that, their thesis, if you look through history, most diverse societies, Ottoman Empire, places you could mention, were actually run by authoritarian rulers. The notion of a modern, liberal, democratic polity with the level of human diversity that we have, be it faith, be it linguistic, be it cultural, be it ethnic, the notion of a democratic polity existing with that level of diversity is actually a very new notion. It's, some would say, only decades old in the whole of human history. And so the jury's out. People in 200 years will look back and see how we did. Hopefully they'll still be a peaceful, democratic, diverse society that we've bequeathed to them and those who come after us. But we can't take our success for granted. And success, in my view, has three key attributes. Firstly, the legal foundations and political intent. And this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam Labor government's introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act, having abolished the last vestiges of the old racist White Australia policy. For instance, that act has stood the test of time, laying the legal foundations, but it alone has not been enough. There are other things that we've had to layer on in that task of trying to maintain a cohesive society in the face of all this diversity and conflicting views. Second part of success, Deputy Speaker, as you would know, is investment. Often that's helping new people settle in. So the member for Banks over there also represents a diverse electorate, and you do have to sometimes give some people a bit more help than others to get on their feet and set up life here and succeed. And investing to allow people to celebrate and cherish their cultural traditions, to pass them on, but importantly, to share them with the broader community. Again, that takes investment. But in my view, the magic ingredient, the secret sauce to success is leadership at all levels: political leadership, faith leadership and interfaith work, but community leadership. And day in, day out, it's the community leaders, the volunteers, the people on committees and organisations who do that work of building our social cohesion and maintaining it. And social cohesion is not an end state. It's inherent in the word cohesion. To cohere means to come together. Social cohesion is a dynamic process. Again, we can't take it for granted. And so when we face stresses and strains on our social cohesion, which I'll touch on in a moment, as we are at this time in our history, we've got to look at all aspects of that formula. Where do we need to strengthen our legal regimes and our protections? And this is a good example, where the government is of the view that we need to strengthen the legal protections and the regimes which exist to protect people from hate speech and to allow people to be themselves, whatever that means, and be safe in the community. Means investing, as the government is, but it also means thinking about leadership. And, you know, I learned a really important lesson in my first 6 months here, Deputy Speaker, in 2016. I arrived to Canberra bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, full of good ideas, and I was shocked to discover that the then government's main legislative priority, which consumed the then government party room with Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison and the whole rotten cabal of the IPA, their main legislative criteria was to weaken the Racial Discrimination Act. That's what they came to Canberra to do. They don't like to talk about that now, because the Labor Party worked with the Jewish community and the multicultural communities of this country to fight and stop the then Liberal Party government weakening the Racial Discrimination Act. It's a shameful moment in our history, and the leadership lesson that I learnt then was that the words that are said in this parliament, the things that leaders in this country do, have real-world impacts. Because what we saw when that rotten government, the now opposition leader, was right at the heart of this nasty little tawdry campaign, what we saw was a spike in racism. Black people, people with black skin, getting abused on public transport. In my community, Muslim women with headscarves being ripped off. You know, Sikh guys having their turbans ripped off. Jewish people bagged in the street for showing the articles of their faith. And so that was the leadership lesson I took. Don't be like the Liberal Party. Don't try and divide the community and chase votes based on dog whistling. And that, sadly, is what we're seeing. As the Attorney-General rightly described the Leader of the Opposition's attempts, disgusting attempts, to politicise anti-Semitism and chase votes as grotesque. It's a serious issue, and I know the member for Wentworth feels this as much or more than anyone in this parliament, and the member for Macnamara over there, given what you two have experienced in your community. It's a serious issue, and it shouldn't be politicised. You know, they call for laws on doxing, don't like to talk about the fact they voted against the laws on doxing last year. Despite calling for them, despite still trying to claim credit, they actually voted against them. So let's see where their vote lands this time. If they weren't in favour of this legislation late last year, see how they vote now. But the strains on our social cohesion are real. The horrific series of incidents, anti-Semitic incidents, in capital cities is probably the most visible sign of that. But there are other forms of discrimination. There's racism. The racism framework released by the Human Rights Commission last year called that out. In my community, I don't have a large Jewish community, though I was mayor of a council, I think, in the member for Macnamara's electorate with the largest Jewish community. I have old and close connections with the conservative and the progressive elements of the Jewish community, if you want to call it that, despite some of the rubbish that gets written in certain media outlets. But in my community, it's Islamophobia. We've seen since the conflict in the Middle East more public abuse and personal intimidation of mainly Muslim women going about their business, shopping with the kids, being abused in the street. It's homophobia. It's all the forms of discrimination which this bill seeks to address. But the government is committed to protecting the entire community from those who want to promote extremism or hatred or incite violence. There's no place for that stuff in our diverse society, none whatsoever. As I said, I decry the politicisation of this. Now, I'll touch on some aspects of the bill. Oh, actually, no, I just do want to say a little more on that point on social cohesion. The Scanlon Foundation work, which is actually the world's longest-running longitudinal study examining social cohesion that we've found anywhere in the world. Not perfect, people can critique the methodology, and it's perfectly legitimate. But the fact that it's longitudinal, even if you want to argue about the questions or this, it does give you a year-on-year comparison so you can see how things are going. And to be glass half full, what it showed last year was actually no change in the headline measure of social cohesion. Pleasingly, despite all of the strains on society, the percentage of Australians who support our multicultural society and support its character and people celebrating their identity as Australians didn't show a major change. I think we're about 85 to 81. But that's a canary in the coal mine. You don't want to see that stuff go down. But what we did see was a significant rise in the number of Australians holding anti-Semitic views, and actually an even more significant rise in the number of Australians holding Islamophobic views. That's what the data said. They're two particular indices for obvious reasons that they've measured for some years. We saw a correlating rise in negative attitudes towards people of faith generally. We've unpicked that a bit. We did it informally. I've talked a bit about this in speeches. The reality of life in modern Australia is that global conflicts, global events do impact daily life here. We're a globally connected society. What happens in the world impacts our communities, be it through family, friends, loved ones, social media, care for homelands and so on. And that said, most Australians, the vast majority of Australians, don't want global conflicts to rip apart our society. I've called out repeatedly what the Greens political party have done, spreading lies and disinformation, active disinformation, again at the other side of the political spectrum, trying to profit electorally, harvest a few votes. It has been a difficult time to govern, standing in the centre of that, trying to, I think, do what the vast majority of Australians want, which is not divide our society, not see our workplaces and our schools and our sporting clubs and public transport and public events divided by a global conflict, because people in the Liberal Party on one hand or the Greens political party on the other want to try and chase us a few votes by weaponising this conflict here. But the vast majority of Australians sit in the middle. But it's also true, I think, that most Australians are like, yeah, not my cup of tea, mate, you do your thing, I'll do mine. But they don't like to see faith groups fighting. That's not part of our tradition. So I think some of that rise in negative attitudes is actually explained by what is a pretty benign and decent response saying, look, just don't bring that stuff here. We don't want to see the fight. You have your view, I'll have mine, we can talk about it. We need to rediscover the art, though, in a diverse society of disagreeing agreeably. I do pay tribute to those interfaith leaders who are quietly looking at ways to start to bridge those gaps and restart some dialogue. It's been one of the saddest things to see break down decades-old relationships, interfaith relationships over this conflict. So, as Tony Burke, Minister Burke has said, if ever there was a time for the Muslim incantation, the word of inshallah, God willing, it is in response to the ceasefire and the current cessation of overt hostilities in the Middle East. And let's hope, for the sake of people in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Lebanon, as well as Australians who are affected by that conflict, that holds. But, that's a bit of context. I think this is a really important bill. I think it goes to that first part of the success ingredient for our multicultural society, that we need to constantly review and, where necessary, strengthen the legal foundations, the protections for Australians, whatever their background. Because, to me, the great promise of Australian multiculturalism is that great Australian promise of a fair go, that everyone gets a chance to fulfil their human potential to live their life in our country, no matter their faith, their ethnicity, the circumstances, how long they've been here, their identity, free from discrimination, and that's what this bill is about, to protect Australians. So I commend it to the House, and I do hope that, as the ASIO boss said, we could lower the temperature.
Thank you.